down those cards.
Fortune teller!
Cards mean different things at different times.
Do you know anything about tarot cards?
Oh, a crystal ball.
Gather around, children.
Listen to the mystic.
Journey.
Podcast.
I'm no mystic.
Welcome to Tarot Tangents. This is our shorter segment where we hit on higher level topics about anything and everything tarot. If you've got questions, stories, or just a good old rant you'd like to share, send it into tangents@mysticfooltarot.com for a chance to be featured.
All right. On a previous episode, we talked about tarot birth cards. So, of course, we're continuing. Yeah, we're continuing the theme because we're going through all of them. In this episode, we're covering a high-level interpretation of two more pairs of birth cards. Pair number 1 will be Temperance and the Hierophant, and pair number 2 will be Death and the Emperor. Dun, dun, dun.
Fun.
So fun. so fun. All right, let's dive in. We're doing Temperance and the Hierophant. So together, these two are all about guidance and mentorship through the balance of the spiritual and material. Natural cycles and man-made structures, learning to understand the value of processes and frameworks, but also when to release control and go with the flow. So both of the figures on these two cards represent mastery and guidance, but, of different realms, kind of like we just mentioned. The Hierophant has mastered the use of the formal traditions and structures as a way to connect with wisdom and gain knowledge, while the angel in Temperance has mastered going with the flow and kind of letting things take their natural course rather than forcing it.
Very cool. Very cool pairing here.
Super cool pairing. I feel like most of the birth card pairings kind of have some sort of built-in tension. There's always, it's we have dualities, we have things that kind of complement each other. We'll get to a few where it might not seem that way, but that'll be in a later episode.
Yeah, it's interesting the synchronicity there, because I feel like, this is a somewhat random practice, but you could have really gotten the Lovers and the Empress as pairings, and that just wouldn't have, had as much natural tension as something like these guys do.
Right. It's easy to write the ones where you're oh yeah, clearly these guys are it's about balancing these two different aspects of life.
Yeah, I'm excited to learn a bit more about this pairing just because it seems like they're pretty much on the same path to me. I mean, one's a little bit more free thinking and one's a little more traditional, but I'd love to hear a bit more about them separately, Anna.
Oh, of course. So Temperance, I think everybody the first thing you learn about this card is the word patience, just, trust the process. So yeah, it is kind of all about that moderation, and it's very much reminding us that there are some things that we just can't force to happen in life. And we have to learn when to allow those things to run their course. The angelic figure has a foot on the earth and a foot in water, kind of representing staying grounded while also maintaining connection with our emotions or spirituality. And a big word that comes up with this card is alchemy, which is at a very, very high level about transformation of matter. Of course, there's a bunch of different contexts about alchemy that we won't dive into on this episode, but it is all about that transformation, turning something that seems like it could never be anything other than it is into this new form. The classic is turning lead into gold is the general summary of what people know about alchemy when they think of historical context, because it was kind of a precursor to chemistry. So that word has been used now in other places like psychology as well.
Yeah, we should really do a whole episode on the history of alchemy, because there is so much in there to explore, from the original, when it was science sort of thing, into the psychological sort of thing. Nowadays I think most people just consider it as a more abstract form of changing and growth, but that would be a pretty cool episode to dive into. One thing about the Temperance that's always surprised me, that doesn't really make sense to me, its astrological sign, I think, is Sagittarius. And I've always assumed it would have been more one of the water-based ones, just because water is such a highly symbolic feature of the card. It's very interesting that it's Sagittarius and not, what are the other water ones? Pisces or Aquarius or something
Yeah.
like that.
Oh, Aquarius is air. I do know that. I feel bad for mostly because I feel bad for Aquarius because it's the water bearer. Like Aquarius is always holding a jar of water, so people think it's a water sign, but it's an air sign.
And it says Aqua, man. That sucks for Aquarius. My apologies.
Everything's working against Aquarius right now.
I just did like a zodiac slur by calling them a water
Yeah,
sign
like,
when they're an
"Come
air
on."
sign.
Like, not you too, Ruth.
Right?
That's a very interesting point that, like, I didn't expect it to be Sagittarius. Obviously, I'm not as well versed in astrological signs and astrology. But I think when I learned that, when I was looking more up about the sign specifically, it's about expansion. So Temperance, it plays into the idea that, like, Sagittarius is pulling back the bow and arrow, and Temperance is about that moment where you're pulling back in order to release something that will become greater. It's like about that
Yeah,
side of
that
things.
makes sense. Yeah, like warrior vibes, explosive. That makes a lot of sense for Sagittarius.
Yeah, so Temperance is like the moment before you release and become something greater. It's kind of like you're in that waiting period where you're like aiming the bow and arrow, but you haven't quite let go yet.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so to like wrap up Temperance specifically, just another note, like that alchemy side of things comes in when we're looking at the two cups, because the angel's kind of pouring the two cups back and forth. And it continues, it's about combining the contents until they reach the desired result. So it's very much about being persistent and dedicated, but serene and like calm about it. It's not like an aggressive persistence. It's like we will just continue to do this until it has reached its time. Yeah. So moving on to the Hierophant, this is the one where we're talking about a lot of like the dogma, traditions, rituals, structures. Like this guy uses all of those systems to cultivate wisdom, knowledge, and mastery. So the most common example associated with this card is religion and like religious practices, especially because the Hierophant like looks like a priest with his, his robes and his crown. But formal structures can refer to many things outside of religion. It can be institutions like companies and government. It can be things like societal norms, social expectations, and like even the education system. And the education system is probably like one of the easiest modern examples. It's like you are going through this very clear step-by-step process, this system to get to higher knowledge and understanding. So the Hierophant refers to using any kind of process or system to cultivate your achievement and growth. Yeah, so the card has the Hierophant, like we mentioned, the priest-looking dude who represents mastery and mentorship. He's got the secrets of the system and established knowledge, but it also has two initiates on the cards who are, earlier on in their journey and are seeking his mentorship in order to grow through the same rites and processes that the Hierophant has access to. So you definitely have like this very go with the flow vibe versus like follow the path of tradition in order to achieve things. So it can be dicey at times, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely a good pairing for the birth cards. I guess we always dive into like the extremes of these cards and that sort of thing. And both of these extremes are like they're kind of gross to me. They're just very intimidating cards, especially the Hierophant, like, because I feel like in the extreme it's like you're intolerable and just like hypocritical, and you're only concerned with the way things are looking and everybody checks the right boxes. And that just feels super gross to me. And it's hard for me to find a balance in the Hierophant because of that extreme, I think.
Yeah, I think also in like our daily lives right now, the reversed Hierophant is probably way more present, where we see people who are just like stuck in their ways and forcing others to live by this outdated way of thinking and believing. And that's where you get like some really bad shit happens when you do that.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah, which like that's great segue, Ruth, because that brings us into like the challenges of these two birth cards together. So, like we just said, any cards in tarot, you can either be like super overactive or underactive in terms of like the way you use them. So the misuse of Temperance in the Hierophant can look like clinging to your process and tradition to the detriment of others, and being overly controlling, micromanaging, and having a very narrow perspective. The flip side of that is doing nothing. Like the flip side of Temperance is like you're kind of lazy And like, I hate using that word because I think it's wildly misused nowadays because we don't allow people to rest. But there is this sense of like, you've become apathetic and like you're literally sitting around expecting things to happen for you without contributing. That's what we kind of mean by lazy. It's like, you know, you should be contributing and you're just willfully not in order to get something different.
Yeah, absolutely. A weaponized incompetence there on the other side of things.
Yeah, that's a good one. Well, that kind of wraps it up for Temperance and Hierophant. Yeah, they are a good pairing.
What's next? What's our next one, Anna?
Death and the Emperor. Woo! Well, Death and the Emperor, I mean, I like the Death card. I know other people are spooked out about it.
Yeah, dark and deep and, you know, mysterious card, that's for sure.
Ooh. They're actually, once again, very complimentary when we start to look at them.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Let me tell you a little something about them, Ruth. In combination, these two tell a story of being an advocate of change, tempered by leadership and a strong foundation. So the Emperor brings structure to Death's somewhat chaotic transformation. So these birth cards aren't about like chaos and wild upheaval, but about thoughtful evaluation in order to restructure and rebuild to make way for something new.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that they have in common is that they're just like very clear meanings. There's no like thinking or, you know, confusion around what their qualities are. And I think that also they're interesting because it's not like you can soften these cards at all. Like, I feel like Temperance, you can find a pretty good middle ground that, you know, everybody's pretty stoked on. But Death and the Emperor are definitely solidly not going to move from their, you know, qualities and the performance of their duties.
100%. Like, I think they probably usually come off as pretty serious. With the Death card, like, I love this. I love this card. It's usually like, sometimes we all get to a point in our lives where we're like, yes, I need something to end. It's time. It's time. But I know for a lot of people who aren't familiar with this card, it seems very foreboding and spooky or just like exhausting almost. It's like, oh, good. Another ending to deal with.
Sure. Yeah. I think a lot of times people confuse all of that with like also throwing in some chaos in there, but a lot of times there's not chaos in the Death card.
It's more like a tower situation. It feels chaotic. It might like internally feel chaotic where you're like, oh, you have like a lot of emotions.
Yeah, for sure.
It's not quite the same as the tower. But really, Death is all about the cycles, like we mentioned, of like rebirth and transformation. So, you know, I think our emotions take over and we forget that beginnings and endings are two sides of the same coin. It just kind of depends on your perspective, and if you were wanting something to end or if you weren't wanting it to end, it'll change how you feel about the Death card and what it means to you. But it's really about releasing what is finished and coming to the end of a cycle of bad habits, a job, or letting situations kind of like just be done, run their course, don't force it. So we can look to nature and the seasons to see this as well. Everything goes dormant in winter, animals rest, plants die, but it's really to make way for the next wave of life and a fresh start.
Yeah, having a light touch on anything is always a good thing, I feel like. I feel like the Death card, its other sort of hidden meaning is like flexibility, which being flexible and having a flexible mindset is really a life hack here to happiness. And I feel like Death is kind of maybe a forcer of that flexibility, but as long as you're, you know, got the mindset of the Death card with that flexibility, then it'll just be easier, you know, when every new wave comes.
Yeah, definitely. Very adaptable. Which brings us to the Emperor.
Not adaptable? Is he? Is he adaptable?
Well, in his reversed form, he's very much not adaptable. So I personally remember the Emperor by thinking of the card as like the ultimate manager. He's the culmination of all the kings of the minor arcana. And he's an authority figure that leads themselves and others to success through structure. And like a good manager, good manager, emphasis on like good.
Sure.
Yeah. To craft a roadmap to reach their goals. Whereas we just talked about the Hierophant uses structure and systems to seek knowledge and wisdom. The Emperor uses structure and order to facilitate tangible achievements and goals. Very much external. So Hierophant has that more spiritual internal flavor to it, and the Emperor has that more external material worldly aspect to it. But they still both use order and structure.
Yeah, I feel orderly for sure, and then death brings a nice little fresh thing to it. Even though it's death, it doesn't seem fresh, but it is fresh.
So fresh. It brings that flexibility and that reminder to the Emperor that, hey, sometimes we need to let it go and you shouldn't force things. It brings us to the challenges part of these two cards. So the unhinged version of Death and the Emperor, they caution against becoming a tyrant. So if the positive side of these cards is about crafting valuable change through structure, the negative side is about becoming vengeful, needlessly cruel, misusing your authority and power to hurt others, and not letting go or not laying to rest what has been overworked. So that's where the flexibility and the order and authority come into play, where we need to make sure they're both balanced and that we're not being needlessly cruel. If the death comes in, it's just I'm going to be vengeful and I'm going to make this bad for you, versus a vengeful Emperor who's using order and authority in the worst way possible and making people's lives miserable.
Yeah, I imagine this sort of person that has these birth cards as the CEO of Goop, maybe, a strong tyrant-y side, but also has the hippie side aspect of it too, where it's not really, too concerned about anything. It's not a stagnant person. They're still in charge, but they still got a nice soft side to them as well.
Reap what you sow. It's very much a death card thing.
Reap what you sow. And as we all know, the only things you can depend on are death and taxes. Don't forget to subscribe. Drop a review so we can find new fans. Tell your friends and follow us on all socials. Our handles are Sweet Death Inc. and Mystic Fool Tarot on all platforms. See you later.
What an ending, Ruth.